So, more updates. So then, and it helps create a sort of imagined community, right? Because they're drawing their own community from so many diverse sources, they have to produce a sort of identity in and of its own, right? So it's not just one particular class that's part of the MST. It's multiple classes. It's multiple races, right? Multiple people from all sorts of different backgrounds. So the Mística, I think, really provide that cohesive glue for the organization. The next one is vitality. And this one is, I think, really important for the organization. And this is what I would say this is one of probably the most important of the four that the Mística serve. And I have a quote here. These are from members. So the Mística isn't simple entertainment to us to help us escape from the disappointments and difficulties of everyday life. It is an injection of vitality which gives us determination and daring so that we can overcome pessimism and push ahead with our project for including the excluded in the liberation of the Brazilian people. The next is, the Mística touches you inside. It touches our lives even more because it shows the mystery of struggling, of dreaming, of having hope, of the world that is out there. So through the Mística, we receive our life, our reality, our dreams, our history. And the Mística give us enthusiasm and give us courage. Oh, no.
Is that right?
So I just read those two. Hopefully no more updates. Okay, so euphoria, Mística is sort of integral to the feelings of fun and self-fulfillment in the camps. So these places are not easy places to live. No running water, people live in tents. It's difficult existence and can last for 10, 15 years in some cases, if the landowners are especially resistant to giving over the land. But nonetheless, you find lots of talk of how happy and sort of fulfilled people are in these places. So the Mística help people say, at least, do part of this. In addition, they provide a sort of cathartic experience. So you'll find people crying or having very deep spiritual experiences during these things. And then finally, discipline. So the Mística are also didactic, right? They teach certain moral behavior through their myths and stories and the songs. And they sanction behaviors such as drinking, domestic violence, sexist attitudes, and individualism as well. They also integrate the militant and the political aspects through very familiar religious concepts. So most of them are Christian, and so most of the people, if they've lived in Brazil since they were born, are familiar with these concepts, even if they aren't directly connected to a church. Okay, so the quantitative results, I've got a lot of tables that might take a little too long to explain and go into, so I just included two here. And this is, of the words that were, of all the texts that were extracted and the words that were found to be in each of the categories, these are their relative percentages, right? So we find that vitality has the overwhelming number, the percentage of words. Discipline plays possibly a lesser role within the Mística. So people talk a lot about the vitality or write a lot about the vitality that they garner from this. In addition, the cohesion is an important element. And then when you compare, that's for both periods together. When you compare the two periods, especially at the beginning of the organization in the early 90s, you find this vitality is almost half of what people write or talk about when they refer to the Mística. And these have changed slightly over time, but their use over time has not, in fact, decreased. So if you look at the references to the Mística, which I don't have up here, it's used much more in the later period, actually, though the percentages are relatively similar. So I just have a few sort of final thoughts. And that is that even though I'm not arguing that the MST is an explicitly religious organization, it is not a church, right? But it uses religious identification practices, and I think it might be fruitful to look at how they use them. The MST is also one of a few class-based social movements that have been able to sustain real momentum for the last 30 years. A lot of them exist for short periods of time, but the MST has really been able to maintain its forward momentum, and I think part of that might be explained by by their use of these practices. And then third, in a sort of more heuristic sense, the Durkheimian approach, I think, allows us to focus on the rights and practices of religious rights and practices for such organizations that might be beyond the purview of the other two approaches to religion and politics. So that's all I have. Thank you. So, questions, if people wanted questions?
Questions, right?
Yeah, that's fine.
We have time.
In the back.
I'm interested in the term Mística. I'm from Peru, South America. And the term Mística is also used in Spanish to nominate some kind of the cohesion and the group spirit, the motivation aspect of a group working together. But there is the other part of the Mística, which is the religious, spiritual force that put the people together. There are examples of Mística in Brazil with Afro-descendants that are related to the Orishas.
Right.
And also in Cuba with the Ñáñigos, and both form secret societies. So my question to you is, do you perceive under these movements that are the secret societies that are that were syncretized through Christianity and are like the secret force behind these movements? Because in Peru there are also these secret and underground movements that are related from the religious and political phase, but at the ground there is something that cannot be seen from superficial eyes.
So, I mean, I don't know if you go to the communities and you see the Mística, these rites and practices, I think you can perceive it, right? You might not be able to explain exactly why these people believe in this thing so much, but it is this spiritual aspect that they're getting at. And I think this syncretic element that you noted on is the clergy, these Catholic clergy, when they started forming this organization, encouraged the people to bring their own practices from their own particular cultural backgrounds, right? So that it was this bringing together of this community. And it doesn't, there's, the theology of it doesn't really exist, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense. They're putting, Marx right next to Christ and, Paulo Freire next to guerrilla fighters, next to all sorts of other religious or historical figures. But I think that syncretic element is essential because you have so many people from different backgrounds, and that's what really allows it to be so appealing to so many people, I think.
I actually have two questions. Sorry. I actually have two questions. The first one has to do with this picture.
Oh, right.
Here. Which confirms something that I had been thinking while you were making your presentation. It is that it has this striking resemblance to some of the pictures that we have from Canudos, regardless of where in Brazil this was taken, that I don't know. But there's a striking resemblance there. And also the Mística, the religious aspect of Conselheiro, Antonio Conselheiro, and how cohesion it was maintained, discipline, the euphoria, all of that is at least in Da Cunha's text. So it's more of a comment. I don't know if in your work you go into this. The other question is related. I noticed that the article that you had in one slide is by Leonardo Boffin, who was a leader of the theology liberation movement in Brazil, who was silenced by the Vatican. Isn't that correct? Was that incidental, or is he an important part of the intellectual group
Yeah.
that works with the
Right.
MST.
Right. So, especially in the beginning, Leonardo Boffi was very important, at least in his ideas, right? And so that article that he wrote especially for the journal, right, about Mística and about how it can serve this purpose. And he is one of only 2 individuals, and he doesn't really write that much about the MST that much anymore, but he is one of 2 who see this as a specifically religious element, right? But he's never had a sort of problem integrating social reform, class-based identity, and religious identity, right? Because he's part of this liberation theology sort of movement. The first question, I haven't looked at the Canudos. I mean, I know of it, but I haven't looked at any of the literature on it. But I think that these sorts of practices apply to many different organizations that may or may not be explicitly, they could be breakaway movements, they could have explicit religious overtones, or they could be, they could do it for a variety of different reasons. But I think that some of these elements, if we broaden how we think of religious identification processes, can encompass some of those.
You may have something, at least for a footnote, I don't know, but that they settled in Canudos, in the Arraial, because it was an abandoned farm that they essentially took over, and they grew and expanded physically from there.
Right. Okay. I'll take it. Christina.
So I'm wondering, and I find it pretty interesting, the use of the Mística or religious practices as a way of providing social movement cohesion. I'm wondering if you know of other cases in other places, or do you think this is unique to the MST?
I mean, I think other organizations can use similar techniques. They're not going to use these specific symbols and to what they refer to as Mística. Yeah, when I think about movements that have a sort of goal, they need to maintain forward momentum, right? And they need to have people who come into the organization who may not truly understand the whole idea behind the organization, but they nonetheless need them to help the movement move along, right? In order to get 1.5 million members, they're not, all the people within the movement are not ardent socialists, right? But the idea behind land reform is appealing to them. But to create a community out of that, that's a more difficult process, right? Because otherwise, if you just have, well, I haven't gotten land in 5 years and I've been living in a tent, why am I still here, right? If it's just that a social movement creates, if it's just that incentive to getting land and not that community aspect, far easier for people, I think, to, well, this isn't working for me, I'm going to leave. But when they have that sense of community, that they're part of something larger, that spiritual element, I think that really provides a lot of strength to organizations.
Specifically religious. Actually,
Yeah.
it made me think of, though I think it's very different, the case of Sendero Luminoso in Peru. So I'm from Peru, already left, but where that was a very small organization, didn't have the same effect of creating cohesion. People were very isolated from one another that were members of it. So very different, and yet the kind of language used by the leadership of Sendero was highly religious and used religious symbolism in order to attract followers. So drew on Catholicism, even though it was a communist movement.
Right.
So totally different, but I just was wondering.
Yeah. I don't know if they're using it, I don't know if the Sendero Luminoso used it cynically to try to bring people in, or, the organization, they were ideological, clearly. But I don't know what their sort of integration practices were, and it seemed to me more of a military, less community-oriented necessarily.
Right, so the cohesion wasn't there, but
Right.
references,
Yeah.
millennial kinds of, and biblical references were used frequently.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially in Abimael Guzman's speeches. Because that was, I think, something people, like in this case, could under symbolism that they were so familiar with.
Right.
Growing up.
Oosh.
I just have a simple question about the transition from the ties they had with the liberation, theology of liberation movement. And then, so when the movement came into being officially, they severed those ties. And I know this is a very difficult, given the paucity of materials available, or maybe the quantity, available might be a little difficult to trace. But I was just wondering, I was kind of along the lines of the question you were asking, how if there's a transition from the clear religious identification of the movement before it came into being as an official movement, and how these religious ritual aspects began being incorporated. Again, if this was something ad hoc, spontaneous, or whether it was do you have any inkling of how it came to be? Because obviously there's a difference between the more Catholic content of these rituals before the sort of secular identification of the movement, and then the mystical elements of all of that were incorporated in a different way, right? Sort of pluri-denominational, syncretistic, and so forth. So do you have any sense of how that transition happened?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the first land occupation is sort of aided and guided by this father Arnildo Fritzen, and he tells these farmers the story of Exodus reinterpreted as a sort of socialist movement, right? And then this makes a lot of sense to them, so they go and they occupy this farm. This is still during the dictatorship. And they put a giant cross in the front of the settlement. Now, my thinking behind it is that the clergy who were sort of leading this movement at the beginning understood that the Catholic Church was, reticent to support such a radical transformation of the institution itself, right? So they thought to themselves, if we connect formally with them, they're going to control the message, the movement more than we want them to. And I don't know that for certain, but my feeling is because it is clergy that are sort of really advocating for this. There are other groups as well, labor unions, these sorts of things that are also at least providing material and organizational resources at the beginning of the movement. But I think that they understood that, it's going to be much more successful if we sever those ties. And they forced, and I think the individuals as well within the communities wanted that, right? They didn't want a clergy who was devoted to the Pope to be in charge of their movement. They had to make that break. And then once they've made that break, I think it's the job, it's an independent organization, and there's no real ties, so they're trying to figure out in those first few years where this Mística falls in with the organization. And I think they fall down on the side of, syncretism. Bring it all in. Let's create our own sort of identity group here.
But it wasn't, your sense is that it wasn't top down, it was something really, I don't want to call it organic because it's old fashioned, but something that kind of...
Well, they encourage them to bring their own cultural traditions with them at the beginning, but then, so I think it was top down, but I think people do that anyway, right? With any pseudo-religious or any movement, they're going to bring their own interpretations and their own cultural, traditions with them. Yeah.
Just a comment on those same lines. There's another student here, PhD student. She's from Colombia, and she analyzes the musical production of parts of the guerrilla, and there's an amazing amount of Christmas carols that say in the lyrics, we members of the park do celebrate Christmas, which is a big contradiction.
Yeah.
But it's part of their musical production, and it's in the lyrics. It's very clearly stated,
right,
saying we are not demons. We also embrace the celebration of the birth of Christ or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's a very interesting.
Does she have any sort of idea why they're doing that? Is that for a cynical, so that the people in the countryside will still? No.
Not at all. Well, what I've heard of her presentation was that no, it's more of a spontaneous. It happens when they gather for parties to celebrate Christmas.
Right.
In their camps.
Uh-huh.
The park camps. So the thing is that the archive cannot be rescued right now because it's
Right.
no one will right now the Colombian government
Right.
And the parks are not really, don't have an organized.
Right.
That's just out there right now. But she does have CDs for
Wow.
those, with the music.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Angela?
So what rate of success do they have, these groups? I mean, did they actually got some land and then was sold to them?
Oh, yeah. So so over the last 6 to 10 years, they've been much more successful with these land occupations and then gaining rights. And the government of Brazil has created it's like the National Commission on Land Reform that deals specifically with these sorts of occupations, right? There is still a lot of violence and there's a lot of fear in these communities that the landowners will send in militia or vigilantes to push them out or possibly kill some of their leaders. But it's not happening, it's not widespread land reform, it's more piecemeal. There's a dispute over this occupied, this settlement, and then eventually, and it takes a while to go through the courts, so it could take years for an individual settlement to reach a conclusion, but they've been much more successful over the past years. And as that slide said, there's 2,000 settlements. I don't know what percentage of them have gained rights and what percentage of them are still fighting for those, unfortunately.
Another thing from the past is that in the early 60s, there was a very strong movement called Ligas Camponesas in northwest of Brazil, led by Francisco Julião, who was a very charismatic leader. And it was one of the reasons that the military claimed that they were taking power for. So it seems to me that in many ways we are back to that. I'm not saying that the military is going to spend pen. I'm just saying that a lot of time has been wasted. We're talking about 60 years. And the military had pretenses that they were looking at the problem. They created something called INCRA, Instituto Nacional de Reforma Agrária, de colonização e reforma agrária. That is important. And did essentially nothing until the return to democracy in the late 80s.
Right.
So it is, I don't know if you went back to Ligas Camponesas and Francisco Julião and their method to the issues here, how they operated and how does the MST operate?
Mm-hmm. I haven't looked at that, no. I'll have to take a look.
It would be interesting if you're going to write this as a publishable article.
Mm-hmm.
Can I add something to that, just very, very briefly, just a comment? Serena is absolutely right. And when you look at peasant leagues throughout Latin America, there were peasant leagues in other countries, most importantly in Peru, in the 1960s, the reaction is very intricately tied to the onset of military dictatorship. And so what is really striking here is we're talking about a 30-year movement. Mm-hmm. And obviously, the military dictatorship in Brazil had just become spent, mm-hmm. or had essentially disintegrated in the 1980s, mm-hmm. at the time when this movement begins. But there is, I suppose, a potential within Brazil, like there had been in the past, for this type of movement, if it doesn't quite become a much more spread out and much more organized one, to actually spark that kind of authoritarian reaction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
In Peru, the military dictatorship actually came in
and did
right, they made reforms themselves, yeah.
Yeah, but the counter to that was...
Yeah. No, but it's interesting how Peru kind of changes the model a little bit.
Indeed it does, yeah.
Then in fact it requires dictatorship to implement the reforms
Although
that
one
they
could
couldn't.
argue that the kind of reform was basically co-opting the Liga Campesina.
You have some lower amount of vitality in the movement along the period of your study. And even though it's a high percentage of vitality that you have in the movement, do you believe that this vitality would stand for so long time without the many ways of transfer of money from the Labour Party and the federal government to the movement?
Yeah.
Because I think that it's a very crucial point in maintaining movements to transfer funds from them. By any means. I mean, Bolsa Familia and those.
Right. Yeah. So no, I think the material resources that the movement gets are essential to understanding how it's able to grow and expand and be successful. At one point in its history, it received a lot of organizational and material resources from these clergy. At other moments, it forms relationships with the Workers' Party or other NGOs, right, to get resources. And I think that definitely has impacts on some of their policies. Areas. I mean, specific settlements, especially. And it might have an impact on this Mística. It's hard to tell. But no, I think you're right. Yeah.
Does the organization get very much into the national news so that people